We're pleased that you could join us for this double lecture this evening, which is celebrating the inauguration of the recent loan of a work by Francisco Goya from the Louvre Museum. Our speakers tonight will be Olivier Millay, followed by Nicole Atzbach. They will each be speaking to the two portraits that are paired upstairs in our special installation, Goya and Lopez, A Conversation. We will take questions following the second lecture. Beginning tonight's program will be Olivier Meslay, Associate Director for Curatorial Affairs and the Barbara Thomas Lemmon Curator for European Art at the Dallas Museum of Art. Meslay is a graduate of the National Institute of Patrimony, France. He received an MA from the École du Louvre in 1983, having previously received an MA from the Sorbonne in 1982. He was a recipient of a fellowship at the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts from 2000 to 2001, and from 1997 to 2006, he served as a professor at the École du Louvre. Millay has published extensively on British and French art, and until 2006, he was the curator in charge of British, Spanish, and American art in the painting department at the Louvre. There he curated the exhibitions D'Autre Manche on the Channel in 1994, Constable, selected by Lucien Freud in 2002, and Hogarth at the Louvre, 2006 to 2007. From 2003 to 2009, he served as the curator for the Louvre Atlanta Project and the Louvre Lens Project. Since he has joined the Dallas Museum of Art, he has curated important shows, including Chagall in 2013, Hotel Texas also in 2013, and most recently, Mind's Eye in 2014. We have invited him here tonight to speak in relation to his recent work as author of the Catalog of Spanish Paintings at the Louvre. He will be addressing one of those works this evening, the portrait of Ferdinand Guillemardet by Francisco de Goya that is on view in our galleries upstairs. So please join me in welcoming Olivier Meslay.
Thank you, Scott. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. I'm very pleased also because in a way, it's a very unexpected moment for me to come to the Meadows and to find back a painting I was in charge during 10 years at the Louvre. I was not I would never expect 10 years ago to be here with Guillemardet in Dallas. And you will see, I think this painting is very interesting on many aspects, but we were discussing that, Nicole and I, in front of the two portraits. This portrait by Goya of Guillemardet is a lot about how a painter is looking at something that he never saw before. And I will explain that during the this lecture. Well, to give you a quick idea of Guillemardet himself, Ferdinand Guillemardet was born in 1765 and died in 1809, quite young. And he has been the French ambassador to Spain from 1798 to 1800, and that was the moment that Goya painted him. And I was just saying to Nicole also that, in fact, Guillemardet was the French ambassador to Spain when Texas was part of Spanish territory. And the painting was painted, we don't know exactly when the Goya painted it, but it was between 1788, when Guillemardet arrived in Spain, and the moment the painting was exhibited in Madrid at the Académie San Fernando. And the painting has been given to the Louvre in 1865. And to go a little bit deeper in the relationship between Goya and Guillemardet, and to go a little bit deeper in the life of Guillemardet, and to give you also a sort of background about who this guy was. Okay, on this side I put Francisco Goya main dates, his birth, when he arrives in Madrid. In 1789, he's printed the camera. In 1792, he has this illness and becomes deaf. Sorry. He painted the Dos y Tres de Mayo. In fact, he ended in France, which is something that we forgot sometimes, but Goya died in France after almost 5 years in Bordeaux. On the other side, and you have this guy who is, Goya is very quickly in the court, he's next to the king, he is also very friendly with some of the minister of Spain at this time, and above all, at the moment where he's painting Guillemardet, he was very close to the power. On the other side, you have Ferdinand Guillemardet, who was born in a very, not tiny, but small town, very old town in France called Autun, A-U-T-U-N. And Autun is, and this is Autun. Remote place, small town. He's coming from a very, not very modest background, but sort of lower middle class. Beginning of the revolution, 1789. You have to remember before that, there was aristocrat, there was the clergy and the rest of the population, and he was part of the rest of the population. And 1791, very quickly, he becomes mayor of Autun, which was quite important. And then in 1792, he became congressman, the equivalent of congressman, député à la Convention in 1792. 1793, it's important to explain some aspect of his embassy to Spain. He voted for the death of Louis XVI and against his deferment. Against the deferment of the death. I mean, he was really among the very extreme, well, there is many like that, but he was among the one who voted for the death of the king. 5 years later, he is sent to Spain very unexpectedly in all sorts of, in any context. He was not the one that we were expecting to go to Spain, to Madrid as an ambassador. You have to imagine that during centuries, Spain has been one of the most important ally or enemy of France, that depends, during centuries, and usually the ambassador to Spain, and it was the same after that, was one of the most important ambassadors for the French diplomacy. It was one of the most coveted posts for an ambassador. And for example, usually you were Duke and you were going as an ambassador to Spain. The most famous of one was the Duke of Saint-Simon, who was ambassador to Spain. He was very proud to be an ambassador to Spain. He was already a duke, but for him it was like being more than a duke to be the ambassador to Spain. For Guillemardet, it went very quickly. He spent only a year and a half. And then in 1799, November, the end of his embassy is sent back to France and go to, as a préfet, which is sort of governor sent by the government to a little region. And then 1806 is préfet of Allier, which is another place, and in 1809 he died insane, probably because of syphilis. To give you an idea also of the very important position that was to be an ambassador to Spain, the guy who has been sent just after Guillemardet was Lucien Bonaparte, the most clever, I would say the only clever brother of Napoleon. Lucien, who was at the same time clever and was extremely good at collecting, which is more interesting for us curator. And he went to Spain with a very interesting painter who is called Guillaume Le Thiers, and that is a painting that has just been acquired by the Dallas Museum of Art, thanks to the Foundation for the Art. And Guillaume Le Thiers was a very interesting man. He was born from a slave and a judge in Guadeloupe, and he was one of the very, very good painters during Napoleon's reign. And he was a very good friend of Lucien Bonaparte. This only to say how important Guillaume Le Thiers, the post of being the ambassador to Spain was. And it's a big contrast between this sort of poor medicine, what do you say that, practitioner, doctor, to go suddenly from almost nothing, nobody, to the ambassador to Spain. Okay, an unusual portrait. And when you look at many portraits by Goya, it's sure, and during this period, it is sure that it is not the usual portrait that Goya is doing. And obviously, Goya is suddenly in front of something he doesn't know. And he's in front of somebody of something that he has to analyze. And this portrait is probably one of the best portraits by Goya, also because he has to reinvent himself to do it. And you have this, first you have this costume. When we will look at the Lopez portrait, it's painted, Lopez portrait has been painted almost 15 years after this. This portrait is, and I could show you, for example, same date, the portrait of Jovellanos. And you have this very 18th century costume, silk socks, these very elegant trousers, beautiful shoes with gold on it, the sort of and then silk again. Beautiful portrait in a melancholic pose of Jovellanos. Same thing, the first minister, friend of Goya also, Saavedra, 1798, exactly the same. And suddenly, hop, you have sort of extraterrestrial guy, a French, coming from a place where there is a revolution. And you have, in Spain, you have to remember, we have still a king, and the king is a Bourbon. That means he was one of the first or second cousin of the one Guillemardet voted for death. That you have to imagine the French ambassador is sent to Spain, to Madrid, to be to represent France, and he has to present his letters to the king, to the cousin of the one Guillemardet killed by his vote. Sorry. Yeah, that is interesting. In fact, the costume of Guillemardet has been designed by David. Not this one specifically, but David designed all the new costume for the French administration. And you have many of the new costume here. And of course, they are very different from the one from Louis XVI reign, which was exactly the same sort of fashion than the one in Spain. And when you go back, these shoes are very different. Everything is different. No socks, no silk, black with some buttons, and then all this tricolor feather and everything. And of course, Guillemardet is very proud. He's very proud to be the French ambassador to Spain. We're discussing, Nicole and I, about the fact that I'm not sure he's arrogant, but he's completely surprised, in fact, to be in this position only 5 years after being a very unknown doctor. And you see that this is a little miniature that has been made in France just before Guillemardet went to Spain. And he's in the same costume. You recognize the costume, you recognize the hat, which is here. You have the sword, which was usually only worn by aristocrats in France. And he had the letters of the ambassador, the letter that the French government is giving to him to represent the government to the king. And he's obviously extremely proud. Yeah, he's happy. And then the other question is, why this pose? Because this is, when you go back to the Spanish portraits, Spanish people portrait, they are in a usual pose of power. That means they are next to the table, they have the important paper, they are sitting in a nice chair, and they are sitting properly. And suddenly you have this guy who is sitting in a very different way. And Goya was probably stunned by the attitude of Guillemardet. But it's probably also true that Guillemardet was quite often sitting this way, because there is another miniature of Guillemardet, which is representing Guillemardet exactly in the same pose, or almost in the same pose. That means the shoulder above the back of the chair, and okay, the hand on the thigh, and looking at the people. In fact, in this case, he's looking on the other way, but it is almost exactly the same thing. That is all about this sort of surprise for Goya, to have to make a portrait of somebody who is not behaving the way somebody of this importance is behaving. And probably also Guillemardet was not a very good and proper ambassador. He knew nothing about the code. It was his first job as a diplomat. He was not trained as a diplomat. He was not very well known even in the Congress, in the Convention in France. I mean, he was suddenly put under the spot and on the spot, and probably not really able to behave. I would not say that he was behaving badly, but he was not behaving the way the others were behaving. In Guillemardet's portrait, there is many other things. It's a very, very interesting portrait, not only because it's different, but it's also because Guillemardet has been at the center of many things, probably not really willing to be at the center, but at the end, he has been very important. It was during Guillemardet's tenure as the French ambassador to Spain that Goya did Los Caprichos. And there is many guess. You have to remember that Goya did these prints at a period when he was, in fact, with many friends on power. But at the same time, doing prints was something that could be dangerous, above all when you are doing something that like Los Caprichos, or like print that Goya was doing at this time. And there is a lot of people that are thinking that Guillemardet protected Goya, offering him to print in the French embassy. You have to imagine that there is only 300 copies of the Caprichos. They were sold, very few were sold at the beginning, because suddenly Goya withdrew the sale of the Caprichos because he was not sure that things would be fine with him and the power. But you have to print 300 copies of almost 80 print in each of the book. To do that, you have to print 24,000 sheets of paper. You cannot do that in a small place or hiding that in a basement. And he needed a place safe. And of course, the safest place in Madrid was probably the French embassy, because nobody would enter it. There is no proof of that. We do not have any clue, but there is a lot of conjecture that are putting this together. And just for the pleasure, some of the engraving that Goya did for the Caprichos. Then there is another little thing that is interesting about Guillemardet. When Guillemardet's family, and I will come back to that, gave the portrait to the Louvre in 1865, the family gave the big portrait, and the family gave this little portrait, this size. Beautifully done. everybody was thinking it was by Goya. And it was the portrait of Mariana Waldstein. Mariana Waldstein was the wife of the chambellan, that means the one who was in charge of the house of the king. And Mariana Waldstein was beautiful, and everybody is still thinking that there was probably an affair between Guillemardet and Mariana Waldstein was Marquess of Santa Cruz. And now at the Louvre there is a larger portrait of the same lady. And it seemed that this portrait that the family gave to the Louvre has been brought to France by Guillemardet himself as a sort of souvenir of his love. She seems to have been very interested by French ambassador because for sure she has been the mistress of Lucien Bonaparte the following year. And now the Louvre has these two portraits, that mean the little one and the big one. Unfortunately for the Louvre, I like this portrait very much, and I sometimes exhibited this portrait at the Louvre with the label Goya, because I think it's a very good little portrait. At the same time, the big portrait, which is one of the masterpieces of the Louvre collection about Goya, is now questioned as a little bit too pretty and too beautiful to be true. I mean, at the end, we have none of the portrait completely sure. That is another portrait of Mariana Waldstein by Goya, which is a very beautiful one, not in a perfect condition, but it's a very, and you can see that she was extremely attractive, even for Goya. Well, then there is the consequences of Guillemardet embassy to Spain, to Madrid. And they are, again, completely unexpected. Guillemardet went to Madrid. He spent only 2 years. He had his portrait made by Goya. He obviously helped Goya with Capriccios because he came back with a copy of the Capriccios. And he came back also with the little portrait of Mariana Waldstein. There is one person which is at the center of everything after Guillemardet came back. He died, and 20 years later, there is one person that everybody knows in the art world, Delacroix. Delacroix is at the center of everything. He was he was sort of adopted son of Madame Guillemardet after Guillemardet's death. And there is plenty of people that are around, that surrounding this Guillemardet portrait or this Guillemardet story. There are three main people. One is, and I'm sorry because it's a very complicated story. There is a lot of love, there is a lot of affair, there is a lot of complication, but it's a great story. Just before Guillemardet went to Spain, he signed as a witness the birth certificate of Delacroix. Keep that in mind. All these people, not Delacroix, but Guillemardet, was from Autun. Remember this little town? Yeah. The bishop of Autun, just at the eve of the revolution, was this guy. Talleyrand, probably the most powerful statesman in France from the revolution to 1840. He was always among the most important guy in the government. He was the bishop of Autun in 1789. When the revolution arrived, he took the bishop dress out and he became a civilian, which was a big scandal. The first thing he did was to say, okay, I think that all the property that the church has in France, it was probably a fourth of the French property. He said, it would be a good idea, it would make a lot of money, we could sell them. And the French government said, yeah, that's a good idea, and they sell everything. And that was initiated by a bishop, which was quite ironic. Sorry. Okay, he was the bishop of Autun, but then after that, during the revolution, he became the Minister for Foreign Affairs. And he was the one who sent Guillemardet to Spain. We do not know really for what reason. But they were from Autun. That means Bishop of Autun, and the other one was the doctor in Autun. Interestingly, the predecessor of Talleyrand as Minister of Foreign Affairs was Delacroix's father. And there is a lot of story about the fact that Talleyrand could have been the real father of Delacroix, to make things even more complicated. Then there is Delacroix. And Delacroix has been a very, very close friend of the family. In fact, for two reasons. In fact, Delacroix became an orphan very quickly, and the closest family in Paris, because they left Autun very quickly, the closest family to Delacroix was the Guillemardet. And I would like to show to quote two things about Guillemardet. When Madame Guillemardet, the widow of the ambassador, died, Delacroix went to sign the death certificate as a witness with Louis Guillemardet, one of the sons. He's one of his closest friends. And there is a beautiful and moving passage in Delacroix diaries. He said, when Louis put his name on the register, he added below his signature, her son. When I signed myself, I suddenly thought that I could have myself the right to do the same and sign her son. To give you an idea of the close relationship, the close knit between the two. And in fact, in a way, he grew up with the Guillemardets and the son of Ferdinand Guillemardet. And again, when he started his diary, the first page, the first sentence is, I received a letter from Félix Guillemardet who tells me that my picture has been put on view at the Luxembourg. That means the first name on Delacroix diaries is about Guillemardet. And Delacroix was visiting the family very quickly. He knew about this portrait because the portrait was standing every night in the I don't know, it was probably in the dining room. And there was also something which was important for Delacroix, was also the capricious copy that the Guillemardet had. He was looking at it very often. That is a portrait of Félix Guillemardet, one of the two sons, who was obviously a very, very nice and very sensitive guy. And there is another portrait of Félix Guillemardet in 1835, probably 2 years before he died, probably from consumption, by Delacroix. And suddenly you understand that all this relationship, Guillemardet's portrait is sort of echoing in the French art through Delacroix. To give you also an idea of the close relationship between Delacroix and Goya through the Guillemardets are these drawings by Delacroix after Los Caprichos. And I show you some of them. I picked only some of them. That is the famous print where the young lady is taking the gold teeth out of the hanging guy. And of course, that was for Goya. It was great to have this, and because he was so romantic. That means these sort of very horrifying things was perfect for Goya. And this is also another Delacroix's copy. And again, this one. And this one, which is beautiful. This is the print, Goya's print, and Delacroix's. Okay, sorry. I will finish after that. And again, I wanted to give you a sort of a sense of the importance of Guillemardet's portrait. It's a unicum in many ways in Goya's career. For Goya, he was probably a sort of completely surprising guy, very bizarrely dressed, and he did a masterpiece from that. But then after that, the portrait came to France and had a lot of impact on many artists, and the first one was not a minor one, was Delacroix. And on first hand, that means for him it was sort of a daily bread to have Goya's. And he was very fond of Goya, and he was also the one who gave a lot of advice to the first biographer of Goya called Matron. And to finish on that, in fact, it was also Delacroix who advised Louis Guillemardet, one of the sons of Ferdinand, to give the painting to the Louvre. That is closing the story. And just for your pleasure, some Goyas in the Louvre, probably the most beautiful of all of them, at least at the same level that the Ferdinand Guillemardet. Marquesa de la Solana from 1794, beautiful standing portrait. Lady with a Fan, Don Evaristo Perez de Castro, 1806. And you see, they start to adopt the same sort of costume. And the very famous still life, the same series that the one at the Meadows with the, I don't know how you say that, this bird. Fez. Okay, woodcock. Okay. Perfect. And the last acquisition, Luis Maria de Sistue y Martinez, which is a gift from Pierre Berger in memory of Yves Saint Laurent. It was in Yves Saint Laurent collection. Some drawings also, there is, in fact, Goya has been, he died in France, but he has been extremely popular among artists very early on and very collected. And I showed only some of his drawings that are in the Louvre, in the drawings department. Very important drawings. And there is, it's only a selection of them. And then to finish, some other Goya, famous one in France, the, I don't know how to call them in English. We said les vieilles, that means the old ladies, the old one. Then there is this very strong, unpleasant pair, which is this one and this one, which could be titled The Preparation of the Meal and the Meal Itself. The cannibals, the anthropophagy. Yeah, I don't know how you call that. And then the last one, which is probably the most spectacular of all, it is the largest painting ever painted by Goya, which is Las Filipinas, which is sort of when Ferdinand VII came back to power, he tried to institute some council, which was called the Filipinas, Las Filipinas. And it's sort of a description of this odd power coming back to Spain, with the king here, the most powerful people around. The painting is far larger than this actual size. I mean, to give you an idea, it's so big that for the next exhibition in London, they cannot borrow it, and they are thinking of doing a replica of it in a room to give a sense of the size. And it's an interesting contrast between the king, this very formal attitude, and at the same time, this sort of very informal people that are in fact quite relaxed, which is a very strange attitude. And the composition is very grand, and at the same time, very down to earth. It is with that that I will finish my presentation of Guillemardet portrait. Thank you very much.
All right. Our second speaker this evening is our own Nicole Atzbach, who is the curator here at the Meadows Museum, a position that she has held since 2010. Nicole graduated from Brigham Young University in 1998 in art history and German, and as an undergraduate, she also studied at Albert Ludwigs University in Freiburg im Breisgau, where she contributed to the catalog Contours, Vases from the Berlin Collection of Classical Antiquities in Freiburg. Nicole earned her MA at Sotheby's London Institute of Art, where she focused on 17th century Neapolitan painting. She subsequently worked as a curatorial assistant to the director at the Kimball Art Museum from 2002 until 2010. In addition to working on several exhibitions, she oversaw the Kimball's Provenance research project with the guidance of Timothy Potts, the museum's former director. At the Meadows, Nicole has played a major role in many exhibitions, most recently the Spanish Gesture, drawings from Murillo to Goya in the Hamburger Kunsthalle, Sorolla in America, and Diego Velázquez, the early court portraits, and the Prado at the Meadows, Ribera in a New Context. She also organized the exhibitions Góngora Picasso, Graphic Poetry, Spanish Muse, A Contemporary Response, and Esteban Vicente in America, Collage, Color, and Somewhere in Between. Her essay regarding the provenance of Sorolla's painting, Sad Inheritance, will be included in a forthcoming collaborative publication produced by the Center for Spain in America on Sorolla's American patrons. Nicole is currently researching the subject she will be addressing this evening, Vicente López y Portaña's portrait of Richard Worsam Meade. Please join me in welcoming Nicole Atzbach.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Olivier, for that great talk. I can't think of a better person to be Goya's ambassador here tonight than Olivier. The current installation of Vicente Lopez's portrait of Richard Worsam Meade, together with Goya's depiction of Ferdinand Guillemardet at the Meadows, has prompted remarks from visitors about the striking compositional similarities between the two. The two cross-legged men fix their confrontational gaze upon us in a momentary pause from their present pursuits. The formal parallels of these two images provoke a deeper discussion regarding the genre of portraiture under the influence of the Enlightenment and the subsequent era of revolution, when the voice and identity of the individual began to emerge from the collective. Doctor-turned-ambassador Guillemardet symbolizes the First French Republic. The tricolore presents itself in Goya's portrait in the plumes of the ambassador's hat and the sash around his waist. In turn, Meade, who had absorbed American revolutionary principles in his native Philadelphia, would support Spain during the Peninsular War. In Cadiz, the bastion of Spain's liberal movement, Meade would boldly apply the tenets of that country's new constitution through published defenses on his own behalf. Meade's extensive support of Spain during the war ultimately led to the demise of his mercantile business and a prolonged imbroglio with both the Spanish and American governments. In spite of his ensuing misfortune, Meade embraced his position as a self-made man who through international commercial success acquired the wherewithal to become one of the earliest American collectors of European art. Meade both promoted and preserved his rare status through the fashioning of his image, as immortalized by Vicente Lopez and other artists, who I'll show you later. So who exactly was Richard Worsam Meade? He was a Pennsylvania native, born in 1778, and he learned the mercantile business from his father, who had established himself in Barbados in the lucrative rum business. He arrived in Spain by 1803, fighting to recuperate money, which he claims was close to $1 million, which seems pretty unbelievable, for multiple claims made by several Americans, one of which was regarding property that was detained in near Buenos Aires in Mar de la Plata. Unable to recover the money, he moved to the Andalusian port city of Cadiz, which in the 18th century had a monopoly on the sea trade, and it was where a lot of trade went back and forth between America. There he opened his own house of commerce with James Leander Cathcart, who served in diplomatic roles for John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Meade's wife, I'm sorry this isn't the best photo. I haven't been able to see this yet in person, so this is what I got. This was Margaret Coates Butler, and she was from New Jersey, and she joined him there in Cadiz with their 2 children, and in total they would have 11 children, 8 of whom would survive to adulthood. Upon the invitation of the Navy Secretary, Meade served as the United States naval agent in Cadiz from 1806 until 1816. Although in his own lifetime, Richard Worsam Meade garnered a certain amount of recognition and, to some, a certain amount of notoriety, it was not long after his death that his accomplishments would be overshadowed by those of his son, George Gordon Meade. And it is with him that most people now associate the name Meade. He was born in Cadiz in 1815, and he was baptized there in the Parroquia del Rosario. And he served as the United States Army General and commander of the Union Army of the Potomac during the Civil War. He's most famous for having weakened the Confederate Army by resisting General Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. Through his achievements, the Meade name often conjures up patriotic and military associations, the seed of which was planted by General Meade's namesake and grandfather, George Meade, who was the father of Richard Worsam Meade. For having supplied money and provisions to the troops at Valley Forge, George Meade was recognized 78 years after his death with the inclusion of his image in the Centennial Fountain for the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. George Meade and other Catholics who had supported the revolutionary cause were memorialized within sculpted medallions. This is his medallion, placed in the basin of the central fountain with Moses. As you probably know, Catholics were extensively persecuted during the 13 colonies, and Pennsylvania was a safe haven for the Meades, who were staunch Catholic Irish immigrants. The great-grandson of General George Gordon Meade was George Gordon Meade Easby. By all accounts, Easby was a modern-day dandy with a larger-than-life personality. He worked as an actor in low-budget Hollywood films, a producer, a cartoonist, and a radio talk show host. He was drafted into the Army during World War II, but as he himself said, it wasn't really his calling. Instead, he chose to oversee the family's art treasures and served as a sort of tour guide to Balleroy Mansion, his Philadelphian residence, which at one point earned the distinction of being the most haunted home in America. And there he is again. This is from People magazine. And this was a distinction he actively promoted. He himself was an art collector, and he boasted to have over 100,000 works of art, both fine and decorative, in his collection. This included Philadelphia Chippendale furniture, Asian export ceramics, his own 1954 Rolls-Royce that was once owned by Prince Ali Khan, who was the 3rd husband of Rita Hayworth. The list goes on and on. He also owned our portrait of Richard Worsam Meade, which is, now we're coming back full circle. Our portrait was first sold at auction in Philadelphia in 2010. And interestingly, this is the back of the canvas. So this is an inscription. I don't know who did this, but Vicente Lopez, and actually it looks like Vicente Lopez. Probably that's an H, which would be Asía, circa 1815. And this is noted in the catalog entry, but for some reason they didn't see it, and so they cataloged it as a Spanish-American school painting rather than by Vicente Lopez. And so it was bought by a Madrid dealer who, bought it for pennies, and then we bought it for much, much more than that. So they got a great deal. Let's talk about Vicente Lopez. So he served before the reign of Ferdinand VII as the honorary court painter to King Charles IV. And he was one of the most important artists of the Spanish Enlightenment. He was adept at painting a variety of subjects in diverse media, such as miniatures and fresco, but he's best known as a portraitist. As Lopez's image of Meade attests, the artist displayed fastidious attention to detail, visible in the rug, in the Sphinx here, on his desk, and in all the folds and textures of his attire. Equally brilliant is the canvas's sophisticated palette. You have the blue jacket, you have the saffron kerchief, the gold cushion. Together, these all attest to his mastery of both line and color, which exemplified why he was such a highly sought-after portraitist. He was appointed first court painter in 1815 and subsequently director of the Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando in 1817. He, in both instances, replaced his former teacher and also his father-in-law, Millay, which probably was quite awkward. And in turn, Millay had replaced Anton Raphael Mengs, who was one of the precursors to neoclassicism in Spain. While the emphasis on draftsmanship and details displayed in this portrait speaks to Lopez's neoclassical bent, such lessons were for Lopez and most Spanish artists of the epoch not learned firsthand. Very few Spanish artists actually went to France at that time. One exception was this artist, who's also in our collection, Juan Antonio de Ribera, who had trained in Jacques-Louis David's studio. Sitting at his desk, Meade seems to have been interrupted at work by the viewer, whom he now turns to face. This skillful juxtaposition of neoclassical rigor and lithe spontaneity in the portrait, as far as I can tell, seems pretty unprecedented in the oeuvre of Lopez. The seeds of this interrupted pose, as we'll call it, shows up somewhat in this portrait of Vicente Antonio de Noguera y Ramon, and I have it paired with the David, just for comparison. We have a physician who is interested in female diseases over here, and he's got his arm on a book by Hippocrates, and he annotated an edition of the History of Spain. This, however, is a posthumous portrait, so it lacks some spontaneity. Lopez must have been looking elsewhere to formulate the composition of Meade. Prints of French and even English portraits must have been in circulation. Sebastián Martínez, who's portrayed here, was a friend of Goya, and it's known that he had a great collection of prints and paintings. And he also lived in Cadiz. He preceded Richard Worsam Meade. There's another full-length portrait, but this is also 1823. And then finally, I just wanted to show you this. This is 1830 to 32. We have a rug that's quite similar to this, but this is about 15 years after our portrait. And finally, to compare, I just wanted to show you what was going on concurrently. Ang was in Rome and doing these portraits, these drawings for money. So it's just an interesting comparison. I'm not saying there's any connection, but it's interesting to look at what was going on. I wonder whether this unrehearsed formality of Meade's image might in some small part be attributable to his own travels. This miniature and this were both painted in Paris, and they're souvenirs from his travels, painted probably circa 1795 and circa 1806. And this would corroborate Richard Worsam Meade III, who wrote that after Richard Worsam Meade I, our Richard, participated in the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, George Meade sent his son to Europe, where he bought some curious old furniture in Paris. And I wonder if some of that furniture may have been sort of empire Egyptian. which anticipated the Egyptomania after Napoleon's invasion in 1798. You might recall the Sphinx on his desk. While exact details regarding the commissioning of this portrait have not yet been ascertained, a search through Lopez's dossier in the Royal Palace in Madrid reveals no documentation about it. His biography would indicate that he commissioned the work from Lopez at a pivotal moment in his life. As far as we know, Lopez didn't travel to Cadiz, so Meade must have gone to Madrid. The painter arrived to Madrid from his native Valencia to begin his appointment as court painter in late September 1814, which would have been the earliest date that the portrait of Meade could have been executed. I do know that Meade went to Madrid in 1815, and he recounted why he was in Madrid in a letter to President James Monroe later on in 1817. And in a nutshell, he was appointed to settle the estate of a house of commerce in Cadiz, and there was a balance of $50,000. There was no reliable bondsman that came forward, so Meade was ordered to pay the amount into the king's treasury, which he did, but then there was a dispute that he actually hadn't paid it and that it had been paid in credit. And so then the case went to Madrid, and he fled Cadiz. He appealed to the king, and the king issued a decree in August of 1815, instructing that all future proceedings regarding the case should be suspended, and until the Treasury could collect enough funds to remit the sum deposited by Meade, which acknowledged that Meade had already deposited the amount. And I believe it was probably during this visit to Madrid that Meade had his portrait painted, around the time of the king's ruling. One other element to be considered is that in some archives in Madrid, it's been documented that Meade's business partner, James Leander Cathcart, was interested in appointing Meade as the Vice Consul General of Cadiz. So I think that this commission for this portrait was to commemorate the nomination of what he thought would have been an imminent appointment. Armed with historical knowledge of two nations, his native land and the country he chose to establish his business, his aptitude for international commerce had allowed him to thrive in Spain, in masquerading as an ostensibly impromptu glimpse into his life, whose disarray of books on the floor has incited a wrinkle in the rug. As haphazard as the composition's element may seem, I think that all of the object's inclusion is very deliberate. Beside the silver tray on the desk is a paper. And I think this is an image of the Pillars of Hercules, which represent the cliffs of Ceuta and Gibraltar. The Pillars of Hercules were part of Spanish royal heraldry since the time of Charles V. And the pillars were accompanied by the maxim plus ultra, which meant further beyond, implying that the Spanish kingdom should expand beyond the boundaries into the New World. The emblem's inclusion in Lopez's painting points to Meade's working relationship with Spain, and also suggests that Meade's export business expanded beyond Gibraltar, which was historically considered to mark the western boundaries of the Old World. And the Pillars of Hercules also had a geographical connection to Meade in Spain. According to ancient mythology, the Pillars of Hercules were thought to be the ancient gates of Cadiz, and that's where he set up his business. Under his left arm, you have two books, one of which at the bottom, it's hard to read here, but it says Ordines de Bilbao. And the ordinances of Bilbao were promulgated in 1737 by King Philip V, and they were almost as complete as a modern commercial code. And they served as the prototype for the first Spanish commercial laws that were struck in 1829. And there's Philip V right there. And these were likely inspired by Philip V's grandfather, Louis XIV, who standardized French legal code. At the top of the stack is a Tratado de Comercio, a treaty of commerce, and this probably may be an oblique reference to the Treaty of Friendship, Limits, and Navigation between Spain and the United States, which was signed by Senator Thomas Pinckney and Manuel Godoy at San Lorenzo el Real in 1795. This is also known as the Treaty of San Lorenzo, the Treaty of Madrid, or Pinckney's Treaty. And the treaty stipulated it resolved territorial claims between Spain and America. And finally, on the other side on the floor, these two books, one is History of America and one is History of Spain, to talk about his symbiotic relationship. Meade's image, as shaped by Lopez, echoes the first line of a pamphlet which Meade himself published in 1912, when he publicly accused the Treasurer General of Spain of misappropriating a large sum of money. The document was entitled "Scandalous Attempt by the Regency of Spain to Ruin Richard W. Meade." And the beginning sentence says, "There is nothing so valuable to a man of probity as his honor, and the interest he has in proving his conduct correct when malice may wish to afford just motives for doubting his integrity." He was living in Cadiz in 1812 when the Constitution was promulgated, so one would assume that he would have freedom of speech under the 371st article of the Constitution. And he related to President James Monroe that he had written these pamphlets in, quote, warm and manly language, but they were not well received by the president of the Regency, who was also portrayed by Portaña, the 13th Duke of the Infantado. And he put Meade in prison for 3 months. Meade persisted in pursuing his financial claims, and he also protested his treatment. And finally, he was fined 2,000 ducats because his pamphlet was considered libelous. He wrote 6 different pamphlets in self-defense from 1812 to 1813, and one of them was called The Pastimes of Richard Meade, and these were written while he was in jail. This one is of particular interest because it was a sardonic response to an incident involving massive quantities of rotten cheese that were purchased by the director of provisions for the Spanish troops. And in the pamphlet, Meade actually, which he described the whole event as a cheese adventure, and he interspersed, while writing in Spanish, in his text, rhyming couplets and quatrains of insults against his villains. And at one point, he calls him the Campeón de Manchego, the Manchego champion. Like these pamphlets, his portrait is also a form of propaganda, conceived in a visual medium. As with the objects that he selected within the portrait, its dimensions were also probably selected by him. He wanted his image realized in monumental scale. Now, a full-length portrait created by the first court painter of the Spanish king would not have come readily or cheaply. The size of a portrait affected its price. So full-length portraits were the most expensive, and bust-length portraits were the least costly. And I think he recorded that he spent over 50,000 million reales helping the Spaniards with provisions during the Peninsular War. And I think he probably became quite a pariah to the government. And so I think it's possible that he used his credits to have his portrait painted. There's no documentation, but I wanted to show you this as well. This is very, very sad I couldn't get a better image for you, but I know where the portrait is, but I couldn't get a better image. This is another portrait that he had done of himself, and it's at one point was attributed to Goya, which it's not by Goya, but it's It's interesting, and it has been cut off, but this would have been probably closer to a 3/4 and possibly a full-length portrait. In spite of the king's decree that I mentioned to you earlier, which suspended the proceedings against Meade, his archenemy, one of these creditors, applied separately to the king through the British minister, and the king reversed his position, and Meade was put in prison. He was taken to the Castillo de Santa Catalina, which is here, and it was an old fortress that was repurposed as a white-collar prison, and he stayed there for 2 years. His detainment catalyzed the deteriorating relationship between Spain and the United States amid the tensions over Florida. And the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, said that the imprisonment of Richard Meade is an act of cruel and unjustifiable oppression, and very strong language. Subsequently, Andrew Jackson invaded Florida in 1818, which helped to propel Meade's release. Jackson's aggression resulted in Spain's agreement to cede Florida. The caveat was that Spain would no longer be responsible for paying $5 million worth of legal claims, and Meade's claim was included in that, and his claim was $500,000 by Americans who had made claims against Spain. The language of the treaty stipulated that the United States would then assume the $5 million debt in lieu of purchasing Florida from Spain. So Meade and the other American claimants fell victims to a loophole introduced by their own government, and the agreement specified that payments to claims had to be enforced only from unlawful captures at sea and unlawful seizures in the ports of Spain and the colonies. Because Meade had voluntarily turned over his assets to the Spanish government during the war, his claim was not enforceable. He continued to press the U.S. government for his money, and unfortunately, it never came to fruition. And after he passed away in 1828, his widow continued to press for it until she passed away in 1853. One might assume that while he was in prison, Meade would have been entirely consumed with his legal and financial situation. And also his wife and children were in Philadelphia by that point. But in 1817, he wrote a letter to the director of the Pennsylvania Academy of Arts. And this letter is documented in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts archive. And it's about a likeness of Christopher Columbus that he had painted and wanted to give to the Pennsylvania Academy. And in his letter, he wrote, "During my residence in Madrid in 1815, I made it my business to ascertain whether the descendants of Christopher Columbus had any original portrait of that great man. And I found that the Duke of Veragua had one, and through a person of considerable influence, I obtained license to have it copied, which I had done by one of the best painters of the Royal Academy, and I now give directions to have the same delivered to you, requesting that you will do me the favor to present it to the Academy in my name. I trust it will be acceptable. It is, I believe, the only copy, as far as I could ascertain, and taken from the original, and it will be found to correspond with the engravings which I have seen in different parts of Europe." So at that time, according to late 19th century scholarship on images of Christopher Columbus, which were in conjunction with the World's Columbian Exposition, the painter of Madrid's Royal Academy that Meade mentions, who made a copy of the original portrait of Columbus, which doesn't exist, was Maella. Maella's copy went missing shortly after it was donated to the Academy, but engraving of it was made by Peter Maverick, and it was included in a frontispiece of the Repository of the Lives and Portraits of Distinguished Americans. So he gave a portrait by Maella to the Pennsylvania Academy in 1817 while he was still in prison. Maella's version was based on this publication that was published in 1793, and these were thought to be accurate likenesses of Columbus. His gift of this portrait basically portends the future that he wanted to, the future image that he wanted to convey of himself, which was that even before being freed from prison and returning to the United States, that he would be one of the earliest American collectors of European art. His collection preceded him, and it arrived in April of 1818. The collection of paintings and sculpture were probably installed soon after his arrival at the Pennsylvania Academy in the Southwest Gallery, which came to be known as the Mead Gallery. The Mead Gallery featured paintings and sculpture attributed to Italian, Flemish, and Spanish masters, including Murillo's Roman Caritas, Roman Charity. It's a very special painting. It's a rare work of a classical subject about the Roman matron Pero saving her dying father Simon. The original canvas was once in the collection of Manuel Godoy, who was Charles IV's prime minister. A particular engraver by the name of Tomás López Anguidanos took it in 1807 from the Cartografía Nacional and engraved it, and then he took it with him to Valencia during the war to try to save it. Somehow it ended up with Mead in his collection. Unfortunately, the painting was destroyed by fire when the Pennsylvania Academy burned in 1845. So we have an oil sketch that was on the market, and this engraving by Anguidanos. What's also interesting is that Joseph Bonaparte, who ruled Spain during the Peninsular War and was the elder brother of Napoleon, also began lending his works to the Pennsylvania Academy around 1815. And once he was stateside, he assumed the name of Comte de Servilliers and moved to New Jersey, of all places. And there he bought an estate called Point Breeze. He managed to have around 200 paintings sent to him from France when he was fleeing Spain, and he had originally wanted all these paintings to become this museum. And he decided to put some of his paintings on view. So both Bonaparte and Mead, who were both in Spain together, simultaneously were lending works from their respective holdings to the Pennsylvania Academy. And this has led to a significant question of ownership, which was first addressed by William B. Jordan in 1985 with regard to a Spanish still life. So in July 1818, there were two paintings by a particular artist named Sanchez Cotan on loan to the Academy. One was a still life, quince, cabbage, melon, and this description closely follows the canvas by the artist at San Diego. The second Sanchez Cotan was a still life, celery, birds, lemons. And it's known that Bonaparte in his collection had two Sanchez Cotans called Fruit d'Hiver, and the Meads also had two Sanchez Cotans. So they were fruits and vegetables. And that's how they were described in 1847 and also in 1853. Mead's collection also went on view in 1831 at the National Academy of Design. And there they were also included, but their description was different. One was vegetables and fruits, and the other was fruits and birds. So this is interesting. And I don't know, I haven't gotten to the bottom of this, but in the 1853 sale, which was the estate sale, there were dimensions listed, and they were both listed as 27 by 33 inches, and they're listed as companion pieces. And there are very few Sanchez Cotans. There are some copies, and some Sanchez Cotans are spoken for and have never left Spain. One which hasn't, I don't have an image, but it's in Chicago, and its motif very closely follows this, but in the empty space above are some birds hanging. And so I'm not sure if that was the other painting, and I don't know who owned it. But what is safe to assume is that the San Diego Sanchez Cotan was in Philadelphia at this time, and it was either owned by Mead or Bonaparte. So in the last years of his life, Meade was in Washington, D.C., and he had yet another portrait of himself painted, this time by Charles Bird King. Actually, he had two of them painted. And he died in 1828, so this exhibition that happened in New York in 1831 was when his collection sort of turned into a revenue source for his widow. And the first lot was The Calling of St. Matthew, and this is a painting by Luca Giordano, and this is now at Georgetown University. And it went unsold in the 1831 and 1853 sale. It was finally sold by their daughter to Georgetown, and her daughter said that the painting was purchased by my father as an original of Luca Giordano and cost many thousands. It was brought by the clergy with the many other paintings to be protected by the American flag and to save them from Marshal Soult, the French commander, and who was in during the siege of Cadiz. Another highlight of that auction was this bust of George Washington by Giuseppe Ceracchi, which is now at the Met. And this was a model for a proposal that the artist made to Congress for this gigantic Liberty Monument. The bust was not particularly to Washington's taste. He didn't want to be depicted as a Roman. So at that point, this particular gentleman bought the bust. He was the chargé d'affaires from the Court of Spain to the United States at that time. He purchased it for $2,000, and he wanted to give it to Manuel Godoy as a diplomatic gift. Godoy was removed from office in 1797, so it was to no avail, and it remained in a crate in Cadiz. Mr. Meade bought the sculpture from this man's widow, who was a Bostonian, and she had been left in dire financial straits after his death. 3 other works in Meade's collection were acquired by a man named Thomas Jefferson Bryan, and he was also from Philadelphia, and he was in Paris between 1829 and 1850, and in 1852, he put his collection on view to the public in New York, and it was known as the Bryan Gallery of Christian Art, and he subsequently donated it to the New York Historical Society. He acquired from Meade a rather lovely portrait cataloged as Velázquez, and early descriptions cited it as a portrait of either Margarita or Maria Teresa, daughters of Philip II, who was actually Philip IV, and rather than his daughters, it was his wife, Queen Mariana. And this portrait is currently attributed to Juan Bautista Martinez del Mazo, and it's quite a nice copy after the full-length portrait in the Prado. Also acquired by Bryan was a still life, also attributed to Velázquez, and I don't know who this is by. I think it's Spanish, and it was probably meant to go over a door. A sopra porta is what it's called. There's still much research to be done in assessing his collection, and thankfully I have colleagues nearby who have helped. It's known that in addition to importing art, Meade was also an importer of ideas, which were then exported to the New World. Dr. Nancy Vogley, who's at the University of San Francisco, published a book in 2011 called The Book Runner. And in it, she addresses a clandestine exchange between a Philadelphia publisher and a book agent. And at that time, the book agent was traveling to Mexico to sell these imprints. And the top sellers were political manifestos that were translated from their original language into Spanish in Philadelphia. And some of these were Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract and Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. This was happening when Mexico was shopping around for a new governmental model following their independence from Spain in 1821. And they were trying to get Iturbide ousted as their emperor. One of the backers for this book running was Meade. And so he returned to the United States not only with art, but he also returned with an entire library of political literature. Imprinted from youth with ideas of free thought that had catalyzed the American Revolution, Meade carried these concepts with him to Spain, where he actively participated in Spain's struggle for independence. He likewise cited these principles in his own legal battles. His time in Spain and elsewhere in Europe left an indelible mark on him in cultivating a singular collection of art that would be unprecedented in America. While particular details about his feats and defeats have been lost over time or superseded by the generations who have followed him, the many portraits of Mr. Meade capture his image variously as a young man on his own grand tour through Europe, as an international entrepreneur and would-be diplomat, and finally as an American pleading his case before Congress. As a group, his portraits hint at a fascinating story of an enterprising Philadelphian merchant who served as a conduit of both ideas and images to and from both sides of the Atlantic during the 19th century. That's it.